What up? I'm Pop Psy Guy, and today I'm going to be talking about some words that are used in psychology that have everyday usage, but I'm going to be explaining both the psychological definitions and the everyday usage and how they differ from each other. So I have written here on this moleskin staff paper several psychology terms that have both everyday usage and technical specific meanings in the psychology world. So the first one we're going to go over is probably the most commonly, how do we say this? Confused term, antisocial. So when we think of antisocial in the everyday usage, we think of someone who is quiet, shy, reserved, doesn't really like to talk to people, hence the anti-social society or socializing. They may be, kind of looking at the ground, may like to read, just people that it's not bad. I personally fall under that category. I'm very antisocial in this regard. There's nothing wrong with it. However, in the psychology world, antisocial takes on an entirely different meaning. So from the psychological perspective, antisocial refers to a tendency towards the disregard of other people's feelings, other people's rights. These are people that they could hit somebody with their car and think, ugh, can't believe I now have to fix my car, that kind of thing. The person that doesn't feel empathy, the person who doesn't feel remorse, that may be the same thing. This is the type of person that would technically be characterized in common terms, in the old psychological terms, as sociopathic or psychopathic. Now, it's important to remember that the antisocial colloquial usage and the psychological usage are in no ways related to each other. They see, you may have an antisocial person who's also antisocial, but you also will likely have, an antisocial person who is not antisocial. You could also have an antisocial person who is antisocial, but you could also, likely have a person who is antisocial but not antisocial. Essentially, big psychology created this term to confuse psychology students and get their tuition money. Now, the next term I've written here is Confederate. Now, if you live in the United States, there's an 100% chance that you know what the word Confederate means in a colloquial sense. Referring to the part of the country, I believe it was 11 or 12 states that seceded 1861 to 1865 till they got spanked. It also refers to this whack-ass flag right here. But in the psychological sense, Confederate takes on a much more benign meaning. Confederate in the psychological sense essentially means, okay, imagine you have an experiment. Take the Milgram shock experiment. It's one of the most popular psychological experiments of all time. Stanley Milgram, 1960s, I believe. I don't remember the college. Basically, the experiment went like, you would have two people. You would have the people flip a coin, and one of the people would be a teacher, and the other would be a student. And the teacher would ask the student a series of questions, but the student would be hooked up to electrodes that would shock them if they got the question wrong. And this experiment was designed so that the person being experimented on would always come out to be the teacher, and the person who would be the student was what they call a confederate, or a plant. They were in on the experiment with the experimenter. So basically the coin flip was rigged so that this person who was being experimented on would always be the teacher in the scenario, because they wanted to see how far the teacher would go in administering shocks to the student when they got the questions wrong, because the way the study was designed is that the student would get the questions wrong, and the electric shocks would be an increasingly higher voltage to the point where it would kill the person. It's highly unethical. They don't repeat that stuff today, but the 60s were a wild time, I hear. So the confederate is the person who is in on the experiment with the experiment. As my social psychology professor said, I have no idea why they call it that, but hey, here we are. Now, the third thing I have written here is arousal. Now, when we think of arousal in the colloquial term, we think of getting stiffies and pitching tents and, you know, big mountains. No, we think of sexual arousal. We think of, you know, sexual arousal. There's not much else to it. But in the psychological sense, when we talk about arousal, we don't strictly refer to sexual arousal. Essentially, it means any physiological or mental awakenings or excitations. So like if someone were to come up behind you and shock you, or not shock, just going over from what I was just talking about. If someone comes up behind you and scares you, you would experience a sense of physiological arousal. You know, you would get whatever. Now my cat's scratching to get in. Shanks, you gosh dang kitty cat. The arousal you would experience would not be sexual unless that's what you're into. It would be more of a physiological type. Finally, the last thing I have written here, and it was kind of I don't know if I'll include this, but positive and negative. So positive and negative in a psychological sense don't necessarily mean good and bad. They can in certain specific senses, like positive psychology that focuses on I believe just the happy aspects of psychology, of well-being, I suppose. But in psychology, when it refers to conditioning, operant conditioning, positive and negative mean addition or subtraction. So for example, in operant conditioning, you have positive reward and positive punishment. So for example, a positive reward in operant conditioning may be to reinforce a behavior. It may be, I don't know if she wants out. You gosh dang kitty cat. So in operant conditioning, a positive reward may be a child does a behavior that the parent wants the child to do, such as taking out the garbage, and the parent rewards the child positively with a piece of cake or a piece of candy. A negative reward in this situation may be if the child takes out the trash, the parent may have the child do one less chore later. So in that sense, something is removed, so there's a subtraction. Let's say a child throws an egg at a house. Positive punishment may be now the child has to do 5 extra chores, and a negative punishment in this situation may be perhaps the child doesn't get dessert for a week, because there would be the subtraction in that case, and in the other case there would be the addition of something. So that does it for today's video. Thanks for watching, everyone, and don't forget to pop Psych.